My name is Stephen Feuerstein. I'm the developer advocate for PL SQL and lead a team of developer advocates at Oracle Corporation, including Chris Saxon, Connor McDonald, Blaine Carter, and Dan McGann. And our job is, simply put, to help you get the most out of Oracle Database, leverage that investment you and your company have made. We started up Office Hours as a program last year to provide a really big communication pipeline between people inside the database organization and our users. People inside the organization include advocates like myself, developers, developer managers, product managers. And the idea is that every month we have dozens of sessions in which you can ask questions directly of our folks and hopefully, get your questions answered and keep you on going. The original idea behind Office Hours, and let me stop sharing for a moment as I gab for a bit. The original idea behind Office Hours was not so much to present for 45 minutes or an hour in the standard webcast approach, but to put out a topic and have some discussions about it. And this Office Hours will be a classic example of that. So I don't have a big prepared presentation. I have a few slides. But mainly what I want to do is have a conversation with all of you about your experiences as a PL SQL developer, or really in other languages as well, and get your thoughts around some modularization topics. So there's a chat window. You can type in your chat your thoughts. You can also unmute. Down at the bottom left of your Zoom window, you should see a unmute button. You're welcome to unmute and speak to the topic at hand as well. Either way, you can even turn on your video and we can see you as you talk, and then we'll turn you off. Let's see what else. I think that should do it. So let's dive in. I'm going to go back and share my screen, which doesn't have much to show for it. So let's get PowerPoint back. So welcome to AskTOM Office Hours. Let's talk about modularization controversies. And the reason you see these, the two topics, procedures, functions, is that the initial idea for this Office Hour session came from a post by Nat Dunn, and he's on the call and will share his thoughts, versus on the topic of, well, when you're writing subprograms, modules, should you write procedures or functions? And as you'll hear from Nat, he really likes functions. And this topic has come up many times over the years, and I've got my own thoughts, but I'd really like to hear yours. And again, if you don't feel comfortable talking, type in your chat message, and I will make sure to pass it on to the group as a whole. Let's see. So let's dive right in. Can't we all just get along? Can't we all just agree that this way is the best way, that way is the best way? No, of course we're never going to do that, because we have different life experiences. We have different requirements. We have different working environments. It could be literally down to the tools we use and how they work with our code base. And again, there's no real right or wrong answer. There's been a big pushback lately. I don't know if you've noticed, about best practices. Some people really hate that term. I have a whole book called Oracle PL SQL Best Practices, so they must really hate my book. But there's this idea that we tend to push against of there's this one best way. So let's not worry about that sort of thing. What I'd really like to hear about is your experiences as a programmer and why you came to the position you came around these topics or others. So we're going to talk about, first and foremost, procedures versus functions. Then we'll take a look at functions and out parameters, schema-level subprograms versus packaged subprograms, packages versus object, multiple out parameters versus records. What could be more fun and exciting? So let's start off with procedures versus functions. Now, I've got a bit.ly there for you. You can type it in yourself right now, and I'll share the article from Nat Dunn on this topic. But now I'm going to cough. Whoops, don't want to show you my take yet. So the questions that come up in this area are, should we only use a procedure when a function won't do the job? Should we always use functions? Does a function always do the job we want? So let's go ahead and take a look at that article from Nat Dunn. And Nat, if you'd like to unmute and share your thoughts on this topic, and then I'll kind of dive in and we'll get some chat going and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks for the back and forth on this before too. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Yeah, so my general question here is that it seems to me that you can do everything with a function that you can do with the procedure. Mm-hmm. Basically, a function is an extended procedure with the requirement that it returns a value. And when I first started using PL SQL, one recommendation I got was that I should use functions for things that I explicitly want to return a value. So just a very simple thing. If I'm adding two numbers, or if I'm getting some kind of equation, that's a function. Whereas anything that kind of affects the database or the application specifically in a bigger way would be a procedure.
Okay.
So I kind of went with that in the beginning and found that when I was calling my procedures, I wanted to know whether or not they were successful. And using an out parameter for that seemed like a lot of extra work, because then I had to pass in a variable to the procedure just for the sake of finding out whether or not it was successful, whereas a function could give me that information automatically. So my feeling was, unlike in other languages, a function, you have to capture that value that the function returns.
As opposed to essentially using the function as if it were a parameter. Oh, uh-oh, did we lose Nat? Can you guys still hear me?
Calling the function. You can't hear me? I can hear you. Can you
just got you back. We lost maybe 10, 15 seconds.
All right, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so basically I can, in other languages, you can call the function, say, just do this thing, right? And I don't care what happens with the result, right? Or you can put it in if condition, say, if my function, then do this, right? With that call. So that's I guess I'm a little off on an aside. The bigger thing for me is that I want, most of the time when I run a procedure or a function, any subprogram, I want to know what happened. I want to know if it was successful. And so
when you say you want to know what happened, you want to know it's successful, so one of the comments that just came up from Joseph was, I know it works when it doesn't raise an exception. And so this classic dynamic that I've seen sometimes when people, and I don't know about your personal experience, but let's say someone comes from a C environment. This is where I think it happens the most, where everything's a function. This is what I've been told. And you always pass it, and because it's always a function, because you always pass back a status code, 0, 1, did it work, or something more complex. And then you say, if, or continue, otherwise do something. And the mode inside the PL SQL would be, as we got it from Ada, that if something goes wrong, an exception is raised. And if we decide to allow the exception to come out unpropagated from the procedure or function, that terminates it. That lets you know that it didn't work.
Sure.
It sounds like you're looking for something a little bit different.
Well, I think the thing, so I get that the big question for me is, that's true with a function as well, but I can also check a function explicitly for a true false return. I can always have my functions return true or false, a function that would replace a procedure. And I can get the out parameters with a function if I want to. So
it sounds like,
other than tradition, kind of, what does the procedure give you that a function doesn't? Why wouldn't I just always write functions?
Okay, so let's go back into the chat and let me pass on what I'm seeing from others before I continue. From Judith, I have seen many developers making a custom from using functions with many out parameters and returning just a status value, probably a remnant from using other languages. So that's kind of addressed what I was talking about in terms of exception handling. From Judith also, I think it's a big plus for PL SQL that it enforces clear syntax differences between calling a procedure or a function. Java, for example, can get very tricky if you choose to ignore or not ignore the return value of a method. And David qualifies, I think, the comment from Joseph about raising an exception. Maybe you can rely on whether or not an exception was raised or not to say whether or not the procedure worked or function worked, but that isn't necessarily the only success criteria. You might need to know something more specific coming back from the procedure or function. Okay, so keep your comments coming, and like I say, feel free to unmute as well. So I'll do my take. So my take is that it comes down to readability of code. You could do everything as a function, but to me, very simply, a function is all about getting something and returning it. So that's why, in fact, the standard for a lot of functions is, or for getters anyway, is get underscore and what you're getting. In object-oriented languages, I guess, I don't like that nomenclature because the function literally is saying get and return something. So why put it in the name? But in any case, to me, conceptually, there's a clear difference, putting aside the code for a moment. A function gets something. It does a whole bunch of stuff maybe, and it returns something. That's the point of the function. A procedure does stuff. And it might also return one or more pieces of data, but the primary focus of the procedure is doing X, Y, Z as opposed to getting X or getting X, Y, and Z. And I carry that, I guess you could call it a sort of philosophical position into the way I code. So if I'm writing a procedure to execute DML, for example, the whole point of that procedure is update employee. It's a procedure. If it's a function, the function would be getting an employee, but it wouldn't be updating the employee. So my starting point is syntactically, they fit different broad requirements, use them as makes sense according to that standpoint. And of course, I would say always put them in packages and take advantage of overloading. In fact, that was something that you mentioned in your article. Let's go back over there for a second. See if I can find it. Might be this one. Right. So you had this actually up here. You had this concern about you have a procedure that, or no, you're calling a function and it has to return the value and you have to grab it and do something with it. And you'd like to do it like this if you don't care about the result. That was the behavior you see in other languages like Java, I guess. And we don't
That's
have
correct. Yeah.
And to me, the answer here is actually quite simple. First of all, and we're going to talk about this in another controversy coming up in a moment, you don't write schema-level procedures and functions. So all you do is have a package, for example, manage employees. And inside that package, you have a delete employee function and a delete employee procedure. And when you don't care about the value coming back, you call the procedure. When you don't care, when you do care about the value coming back, you want to use it in your code, then you call the function. And then this issue of, oh, I don't know which one to call or which one to write it just goes away. It's just a matter of me writing a single overloading. And of course, the implementation would be that one of those is implemented with the other one. Usually the delete employee, well, usually what I would have is probably 3 overloadings. I would have 3 delete employees. One is a function, though I'd probably skip the function one, and that you would include that. Then I'd have 2 procedures. One that says, and probably better for update. So insert employee would have 2 procedures. One version of it inserts the new employee and returns as an out parameter the primary key. And that could also be an overloading that is a function. So the function returns the primary key. The second or third overloading of delete employee of insert employee would not return the primary key. And it's precisely because of the reason you're describing here that there are different use cases. And I really hate to have to declare a variable to grab a value back when I don't care about the value. And a great example of this is DBMS SQL execute. So many of the times when I'm executing my dynamic SQL statement, I don't care about the value coming back. But the DBMS SQL interface only provides a function that returns the value for execute. Whereas if they had simply overloaded that, we'd never even realize, that there were these differences. We just would use it in the most natural way. Back to PowerPoint land. So go ahead. And comments from the crowd? I haven't seen any new chats. There we go. Does that mean you would always use a single column primary key? Well, I pretty much always use a single column primary key, yes, an auto-generated primary key, either with sequence or with the identity column. So yes, Eric, I always have a single column primary key. I might have a surrogate key or a multi-column key that's unique, but it wouldn't be the primary key for that row. That's the approach I take. And as Eric points out, he's lost count of the number of times he's written dummy variable. Like you got a problem with somewhere in your application if you have to declare variable called dummy, and then you call DBMS SQL execute, right? And so if you find yourself doing that yourself, like having to declare dummy variables that you're never going to use to get around a limitation of the API, well then ask yourself, do I have any say over that API? With DBMS SQL, you don't. I don't either. But for your own code, you can add that overloading and avoid that kind of poor coding practice. Nat.
Yeah, so in that case, I mean, that's a case where you use a procedure and then you don't have to worry about assigning the result to anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So that's the one kind of weakness I see of functions. My kind of take on your take is that
Mhm.
that this is, I think, sort of a general take. That's like other advice that I've heard, and it seems to be just the way people do things. And there's a very good reason to do things the way other people do them, right? So that so that this if this is a
Sometimes,
traditional if this
sometimes
is
there's a terrible,
well if
no
this
good
is the
reason.
traditional approach, it's nice to code in a way that other PL SQL developers are going to recognize. Um, but I think my feel on this is it's more of an advantage that you get out of it being a common practice than an actual advantage
But I
of the
don't understand
language.
the advantage of always having a function. So if I don't have anything coming back, so for example, in many cases, my procedures, they do things and there's nothing that I need to get back from them, nothing at all. No out parameters, no return value. And the only issue is, did it finish to completion or not? If it didn't finish to completion successfully, an exception is raised, and that is certainly a key paradigm of PL SQL. If I hope we're not having a discussion about whether we should kind of suppress the exception handling
No,
architecture and always return status codes. I mean, people can make the argument for that. They can write their code like that, but I think it turns into an abomination. And I think your point about within any given language, there's a community and there are standard practices that develop over time, not necessarily all great. For example, the way that I format my code has become the standard in the PL SQL world, and a lot of people hate it. Sorry. So I think it's good to
but,
keep, but I think, the idea of overriding exception handling architecture in PL SQL to go with always having functions and status codes, that would be a bad choice.
yeah. So let's take a delete function, a function that
Mhm.
just deletes a record in the table, yeah, or a subprogram that does that. So I think um, the common practice would be to make that a procedure.
Mhm.
And to me, it feels like you would want to know not only did it succeed or fail, but whether a record was deleted.
But that's what
Uh,
succeed or fail means. I'm not sure that delete is a good example because the only update might be better because you can get stuff back from an update. But with the delete, I mean, what I would do, well, sorry. If a delete didn't happen, there are two reasons why a delete might not happen. One is that an error was raised.
right,
Another is that you didn't find a row.
right,
And so I guess what you're asking is, so there we have a situation where sometimes you want to know if a row was deleted or not. Sometimes you don't care. You just try to delete it and you're done.
right,
And then it becomes a matter of how to communicate back that information.
exactly.
Right. So for example, my feeling in that case is, or for those kinds of specific requirements that you're looking at, when you've got a package in which you can do your overloadings, that's great. So you want to do a delete employee function because you've got this requirement where you want to know if delete employee equals 1, I guess for deleted one row or whatever approach you decide to take, which then has to become a standard in your application as well. Create a function, create the procedures as I mentioned before. So to me, overloading helps you escape from
Right,
this issue of, should I do a procedure versus a function? Why get into that versus? There
right,
are,
right.
to
Yeah, that
me,
makes sense.
there are natural ways that the code flows in terms of readability and usage that make sense accordingly as a procedure or a function. And as since Java, for example, lets you blur the distinction, essentially, what it seems like what Java says, and this is just from what Judith was saying, um, you can use a function as if it were a procedure. That seems to be the case, right? You can just call it.
Yes, right,
Well, it's a procedure then. It's not a function. It's just that Java is loosey-goosey enough to let you do that. In PL SQL generally, we're kind of locked down a bit tighter, right? We're a strongly typed language. We got clear approaches to syntax that you follow, and so we actually have different structures. So then maybe it becomes a matter of, oh my God, I've got these two different keywords I have to remember. Which should I pick? Let me go back over here to the chat
sure.
for a moment because there's a bunch from Joseph. Manually creating and managing status variables for every single subprogram isn't necessary with PL SQL. It already has built-in status code management, the exceptions, and so on. Why expend extra manual effort when you can use the built-in features? And I think there, the point, Joseph, that Nat was just mentioning is that for a DML operation, I sometimes want to know how many rows were modified, right? And so there's no exception. I have to be able to communicate that SQL row count back to the calling program. And we can discuss lots of different ways to do it. I think choosing a function to return that value is a fine idea. But then I think you just want to really make it a standard across the entire API.
Hmm.
Using manual status code management also raises the risk of different developers taking different approaches, just what I was saying. So the importance of consistency there is really, really important.
Hmm.
If you encapsulate logic in a procedure, you can also shield it from ever being called inside a SQL query. You can't do that with functions. Now that's an interesting point. What if I don't want people to call my logic from within SQL? Put it in a function, then they could possibly use it. I like that.
Right. Right.
From PDV BV, I'm mostly neutral on proc versus function, but for functions, I expect no modification of the parameters. In other words, out parameters, we're going to talk about that in a second. Whereas my procedures would be allowed to modify the parameters by reference passed to them. This helps to distinguish when by value or by reference is used. And from Oren, you can still use a function for returning a composite primary key with a user-defined type or a record. Absolutely right. Okay. All right.
Yeah. That's good.
Other
you.
comments, thoughts, Nat? Anybody else? All right. So my take, before we move on, is that first of all, this is not it's not a religious conversation, right? It's not like, oh my God, if you do one of these, you're terrible. If you do another thing, you're terrible. It should be natural to you. It should, to me, the most important thing is remembering that you're writing code today that you and other people will be using probably for years to come. So you just want to write it in the most clear, intuitive way possible. And so, again, it falls back to me, not so much on procedure versus function, but taking full use of the language and the different language structures, and in particular here in packages, so you can use overloading to kind of blur, do what Java does. You can blur the fact that it's a procedure or a function simply by providing different overloadings. And then people just write the code as is most natural to them, and they don't even have to think about it. Okay. Oh, and Tim is saying in Java, they largely escape the function versus procedure argument by just calling them all methods. That's a good idea. In the ideal application, I'd expect a function to make no changes and be usable in where clauses. Really good points there. Okay, so let's go on to the next topic, which is kind of related, I must confess. Functions and out parameters. Should a function ever have an out parameter? What's the impact when it does? And I don't want my take there. Darn it, that was supposed to wait. No, I guess it doesn't want to wait. There we go. Okay, we'll wait on my take. So any thoughts from you about should a function ever have an out parameter? What's the impact when it does? I'll give you guys a second, then I'll chatter on and on. Okay. So my feeling, if I can manage to get this working, there we go. My feeling is that functions should not have out or in-out parameters. That if you're calling a function, the whole point of the function is to return something. And so anything that the function is returning is returned through the return clause, period. And if you've got a situation where you need to return multiple different kinds of information, you could, well, construct a UDT, a user-defined type, an object type, or a record type, and return it in the composite. I think that could get really tricky and overwrought at some point. For example, especially if you're combining different information in that record. For example, the status, along with some different out values, then you have to know how to figure out which attribute, which field of the record corresponds to what. My feeling is like if you've got multiple out values you're returning, switch to a procedure. Let's see. With a function, preferably no out parameter, but not religious about it. So the correct approach would be function equals return value only. And Sven points out that a function with an out parameter breaks the logical construct of being a function. So change it to a procedure if out parameters are needed. Any differences on this one? Nat says, again, this feels like a convention to me more than language design. Functions shouldn't have out clauses simply because developers have long recommended that functions shouldn't have out clauses. Well, I suppose that's true. And of course, the PL SQL team could have said, you know what, we're not going to allow outer and out parameters in functions. I'm glad they didn't do that because locking the language down too much makes people really detest the language. So having the flexibility for you to take different approaches is a fine way to go. And again, if you've taken the approach of, I'm not going to write procedures, I'm only going to write functions, then essentially you will end up using a function like a procedure, which is that you might have as your standard in your application that a function always returns a status code, 0 for success, 1 for not success, or a whole range of different values, maybe in the minus 20,000 range. And then you might have out and in-out parameters in the function to do the things that you'd be doing outside of the status code, or returning things outside of the status code. And in that sense, we go back to the previous slide of functions versus procedures. You're using a function like a procedure, and if that's what you're going to do, go for it. Now, certainly there's a very clear impact without parameters in that you cannot use them in SQL. So what I'm doing is creating a really simple function with an out parameter. So I'm returning sysdate. Actually, I guess I should set something to s. So if I create the function, I could then call it inside PL SQL. Let's do that. So I'm going to call the function. I'm going to pass back a value, display it. And then I'm going to also use it in a SQL statement. So select my function. One of the most wonderful things about functions is you can call them inside a SQL statement. There are a lot of different things to be concerned about with doing that. In fact, we had an office hour session on this topic by Chris Saxon a couple of months ago. Calling PL SQL functions inside SQL is very powerful and fraught with things to be concerned about or be aware of. If I run this, created the function, displayed my output, but when I tried to call it in SQL, my function has out arguments. Can't do it. So that, I think, is probably one of the biggest drawbacks around using out parameters and out parameters in a function. You can't use it in SQL. Now, that could also be the way that you are saying, never use this in SQL. It's not appropriate for SQL. So that's good too. Okay, let's go to some comments. I have seen lots of functions without parameters. Mostly they were procedures. Here, the function returned a value as to whether the error happened or not. Something I would never suggest to do. Again, that's your style debate. But calling PL SQL from SQL opens up a whole new area of debate. You can do it, but it's easy to get performance problems. And as Tim points out, well, there's more than one way to easily get performance problems. I have no problem getting performance problems in my code, that's for sure. So certainly the whole topic, David, of calling a function, PL SQL, your own function in SQL, is a big topic. As I said, it's in the previous sessions. In fact, let's go over to my office hours page. So if you come to visit this page, click on all sessions. You can go back and look through various different presentations. Here's calling PL SQL functions from SQL. And if you click on that link, you can then watch the video right here. So David, complete agreement with you. This is not a topic to treat lightly. And it's something that you need to pay very close attention to, especially if you ever call a PL SQL function in the where clause, because it will be executed for every row being evaluated, and especially if your PL SQL function has a SQL statement in it as well, which probably would be best to avoid, but sometimes you do it, and you just need to be aware of the challenges or issues up front. Okay, so functions and out parameters, I'd say my takeaway is that the only reason generally you'd want to have out parameters inside functions is you're using functions as if they were parameters. Next, I imagine some of these will invite a lot less conversation than others. Schema level versus packaged. So should I do a create or replace procedure at the schema level, or should I put the subprograms in packages? So if you look at you should be able to click on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, and then you should see a yes, no that you can click on in the participant list. So how many of you create for production use schema level procedures or functions? So not everything goes in packages. You actually do have in production schema level procedures and functions. I'm gonna click on the yes because I'd like to say I never do it, but I almost never do anything. I'm always breaking my own rules. So I'm gonna go for yes. So I've got 6 yeses, I've got 5 nos. All right. So it happens. And James says they are expressly forbidden in my organization. Cool. And I guess, I haven't thought about this, but it seems like it's possible to write a DDL trigger to stop you from creating schema level triggers. I'm going to see if I can create one of those. So a lot of variety. And in fact, it looks like it's pretty evenly mixed from the folks who have responded, yes and no. So my approach is that, and feel free to add your comments in addition to just the yeses and nos. My feeling is that as much as possible, I put everything inside packages. I avoid schema level procedures and functions, except for a few circumstances, or really one that I can think of. I especially avoid putting a lot of code inside anonymous blocks, and I'll pretty frequently see people submit code on AskTOM or send a question via Office Hours or directly to me that has a tremendous amount of logic inside an anonymous block. I mean, literally hundreds of lines of code. And when I say to them, why don't you put this into a procedure, or why don't you put it into a package? They say, I'm just going to run it once. And I'm thinking, seriously? I can remember all the times I said I was just going to run it once. And then at a minimum, a few months later, I'd say, oh, I need to do something like that again. Not the same, but different. But I'd sure love to have that to copy and change. And it'd be a heck of a lot easier to find in some kind of stored program unit, especially a package. And then, of course, the more common experience is you say you're just going to need it once, but my God, you need it again and again and again. So try to anticipate future needs as much as possible in a reasonable way, and take your code out of anonymous blocks, put them inside procedures or functions, probably procedures, if there are processes like batch processes you're running, and then put them inside packages. I'd say the main reason to put them inside packages is it gives you a namespace in which you collect together related things. And if you don't do that, certainly if you don't write with packages at all, you're almost certainly facing enormous amounts of chaos in your development organization. You'll mostly build in packages. If you don't, you have literally thousands of entries in your schema browser for all these different procedures and functions. And most likely you come up with a prefix. And this would be a really good indicator of the need for a package. You have a prefix in front of procedures and functions that all belong together. Well, if they all belong together, don't put it in the prefix, put it in the package name and put them in the package itself. So I've got some comments here. Peter K says, I'm slow. I have been using schema-level subprograms, but I'm slowly moving them into the packages to tidy it all up. And there's also a question from PDVBV. We know that packages are preferred, but I'm never too zealous about it. Probably a good idea in general is to not be too much of a zealot about anything if we can help it. And also a question, does anyone use the block at the bottom of a package to initialize the package? So I'll put that out as a question in case any of you have done that yourself. Let us know what you're doing in terms of package initialization. And Joseph said, the main benefit to packages I see is the ability to modify the package body without invalidating dependent subprograms. Yes, thank you, Joseph. I certainly didn't go over the full list of why you should use packages. In fact, there's another Office Hours session on building APIs with packages, and that's covered there. But that's correct. So the key thing around packages is that you have a difference between the specification and the body. They're separated out. And as long as I only make changes to the package body, all my external dependencies are on the package schema, package specification only. So they don't have to be recompiled, which is incredibly important, especially in a production environment. Joseph also says that I rarely use package initialization because it invalidates, it creates package state. And if you, does an initialization section always mean package state? I would think it would only have package state if there are package level variables or constants that are being set. So, but the point there is that if your package does have state and it's invalidated, you might get the ORA 4068 errors, and you might be wanting to look at addition-based redefinition. Martin points out that using all dependencies view doesn't tell you which proc within a package uses which object. So this is true. So one of the nice things about having stored program units, in other words, not putting code in anonymous blocks, is that when it's compiled into the database, the PL/SQL compiler and all the other elements in the engine store lots of information or deposit lots of information about your code into various data dictionary views that you can then access to get information. The all dependencies view, which has been around for forever, only gives you information down to the program unit level. So you can find out, for example, which packages use package B, or which packages are dependent on table A. But you can find out through all dependencies through the data dictionary views, dependency views, which subprograms of a package are used by different other program units. But you can do that with PL scope and the all identifiers and all statements data dictionary views. Some other comments. Package initialization can come in handy for initializing cached data structures. And you're right, Judith. That is pretty much the main idea behind package initialization, is that you're initializing some package state with some values. And it's run once within your schema. So it's initialized to your schema. And so that, I think, has been commonly used over a number of years. With the transition to web-based applications in which the app itself is stateless, in which you have connection pooling, and each connection, so as you go through the connection pooling, you might be connected to a different session with different session initialization. You probably don't want to be depending on package initialization anymore, because what you'll be doing is constantly be rerunning that initialization code. Sven, do you have a different experience with that in terms of, you said package state is useful, not something to avoid? I see it as much less useful in the stateless environment of web-based and mobile applications. And another comment that you can also use package initialization as a way to audit who is using your package. Interesting. So every time it's touched, the package is initialized, you write something out to a database table, a logging table, sort of like a trigger for a package. How interesting. And here's a comment from Kevin. We are having common utility packages that are commonly used by many other packages. One dilemma we are facing is whenever we need to make change to a common utility package, it's very hard to deploy. Many programs are running in the database that are independently using common utility packages. Yes, Kevin, I can see that being a problem. So one of the solutions is to use addition-based redefinition. That should handle a lot of the issues. And in fact, we just, to go back over to the browser, if we go back into all sessions, back in July, we did a session on addition-based redefinition and talked about how you can use it for avoiding downtime and avoiding issues with package invalidations for package PL SQL changes. And also, you can just do a search online for EBR and get a lot more resources, especially from Oren, who's been a great user of EBR and a great promoter and explainer of the technology. So that would definitely come in handy there. Back over to PowerPoint. Where did my chat go? There it is. So, and the other thing about common utility packages is use them with care. Sometimes I've created a utility package, in fact, in the Oracle Dev Gym, the main app that I support on a production basis. There's a package called QDB Utilities, and it's my shared, actually there's another one called QDB Config, which mostly has package level, application level constants. And I would say at this point that I probably use QDB Utilities for too many different things, and it should be broken up into multiple packages. So, and then at least when you make a change, the impact of that change is isolated into that one package. So you also want to be careful about how you create those commonly used packages. Sven points out that package state is not equal to global state. Package state can cache data that you can reuse inside the same long-running logical transaction session. Very good point, Sven. So if I call something in a package, and in a part of that process I initialize some variables, initialize the state of the package, and then I'm running through and using those values over and over and over again in that particular session access or execution, then you will be able to leverage the session values, and it will not possibly be changed or reinitialized. No question there. Addition-based redefinition is new to me. What version of databases support this feature? Yes, 11GR2 does support EBR, but you really want to, I hope you can get upgraded past 11G soon for a whole lot of different reasons. Enhancements and bug fixes around EBR are pretty substantial starting in Oracle Database 12c and beyond. So try to get there before you start working with EBR, but I'd say right now you can start exploring it, trying it out, getting set up. Okay, good. I'm glad, Kevin, that you come away from this session with a renewed interest in or learning about EBR. Let's see if I missed anything. Okay, and just finally, one other point here. In terms of using package-based versus schema-level procedures, one of the ways that I use the schema-level subprograms is to temporarily introduce some new logic into a production environment. So I may be limited on what I can deploy. I may not want to interrupt the current set of packages with invalidations. I may not be using EBR. So I'm adding some new functionality, and I need it now, but I don't want to modify the package that it should go in. So I'll sometimes create it as an independent procedure or function, use it that way, and then with the next deployment, roll it in. Next topic. We might be starting to run. Yep, we're doing good on time. So packages versus object types. So you can do object-oriented development with PL SQL. Should you? And let's go over to Live SQL while some comments might be assembling themselves there. So if I go to Live SQL and go to search, and search on object type. So in the world of PL SQL or Oracle database, no, I didn't want to start coding. Sorry about that. PL SQL is a procedural language. It's not an object-oriented language, but starting in Oracle 8, we added the object relational model essentially to Oracle in general. And that includes the ability to create what are called object types, our equivalent of classes. And if you search on object type in Live SQL, you'll just find a whole bunch of different scripts and you can check things out. For example, here's a script I wrote around object type hierarchies. And you can create a type as object. So this is essentially the same as a class. I can create hierarchies of classes of object type. So food is the root. Dessert is a type of food that contains chocolate. And an object type can have a specification and a body. So there's my implementation of my price function. And every cake is a dessert. So a cake is a dessert that has a diameter and an inscription and so on and so forth. So you can create object type hierarchies. You can even do things like dynamic polymorphism, which is different from static polymorphism, which means that at runtime, the engine will look through your different hierarchy, your different methods across different hierarchies. So for example, my food type has a member procedure, a member function called price. And then dessert has its own overriding member price, and maybe cake does too. And cake has its own overriding member for toString. And so at runtime, when you say call toString or the price method, the engine will determine which of those different methods should be called. That's called dynamic polymorphism. So we have a fair amount of functionality at this point in the way that we're doing this, in the way that we're supporting object types. And the question becomes when and if you should use them. So again, do go to Live SQL and check out some of the examples there if this is all new to you. And let's see what comments we've got. Tom Kite used to say about object types, yes for PL SQL development, but categorically no for storing them in the database. Well, sure. So I don't know if Tom meant yes, you should always use object-oriented development. Probably not. I think he might have been saying, sure, it's okay, it's in the language, why not? No to storing them in the database. So you can create tables of object types, a column. You can have an object type table. You can also have a relational table that has object types as columns. And do you want to do that? It's pretty much an approach towards denormalization. And of course, in the object-oriented world, the idea of normalizing your data is totally ridiculous. And instead, each object has within it everything it needs. So very different paradigms for development. My take is that unless you're trained in object-oriented development, within PL SQL, stick with packages. If you come into PL SQL from an object-oriented world and you love the paradigm and you feel like the application you're building is well suited to using object orientation, evaluate the features of PL SQL object types. They're not going to give you everything you had in a true OO language. And some of it's not very good at all. For example, you can't have private attributes in an object type. Everything's public, which is kind of strange and unfortunate, but there it is. The second point would be, if you are going to go with object types, fine, but put most of your code for implementing your business rules and your logic PL SQL packages, and then call the packaged code from within your object types. And I think that will give you the best of both worlds in a sense. And Eric says, I think I've only ever used objects when I needed SQL-friendly composite objects for some reason, not methods. So one of the other advantages for object types historically has been, for example, with pipeline table functions, you could return a nested table of object types and essentially map a multi-row select back into the attributes of the object type or vice versa. So it would help you with some of your pipeline function or in general, table functions that return non-scalar collections of data. And in later versions of Oracle, that's relaxed in terms of being able to use records as well. Okay, so packages versus object types. Don't do it unless you're versed in object orientation or there's a specific narrow need to use object types, such as with table functions. And in general, you're working in a procedural language, stick with the procedural features. M. West also says, I have read that object-oriented or object types cannot run in activities in parallel. We do a lot of concurrent processing against database tables, like inserting into a table. I have to say, I haven't heard about that. I don't know. It could very well be true that there are limitations on using object types when you're doing parallel activities. Alrighty, moving right along because we're going to run out of time. Multiple out parameters versus records. So don't you hate those long parameter lists with a dozen out parameters? And this piece of code here, this get survey, this comes right out of my code base for the player manager package of the Oracle DevGem backend. It was really easy to find. And there it is, a classic example of, let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12, or 13, or 14 out parameters. And so the classic idea that people would take to this is, don't return all those different out values. Have a single record that has all of them in them. And then you just have that one parameter coming back out, and maybe even turn it into a function. So what do you think, folks? Would you all agree that you should change this to a record? And if not, why not? Any thoughts on that? And you can click on your yes and no's if you want. But I guess we have to clear them out then. Let's see, can I clear them out? Clear all, yes, okay. And I do have a couple of other comments while you're thinking about records versus out parameters and what you would do with my get survey example. When I use object types, I use case-sensitive names for private attributes and prefix them with private. And no developer likes to use case-sensitive names. Yes, yes, Nils, that's a fantastic idea. So if you put identifier names within double quotes, then you can pretty much make them whatever you want. You can make them as crazy looking. You can have a variable name or a column name that has 15 spaces in it and nothing else. And so that can be a way to let people know that you should not use this thing. This is not for you. It's not for public consumption. I like it. It'd be nice to have it built into the language, of course, but you do what you got to do. And Judith says, one such example, and Judith, is this an example of returning of records versus outs? Simulating multiple values returned by a scalar query before lateral became available in SQL. And then change to a function returning a record. Sven says, use JSON as your output. Sure, why not? Eric says, in parameters can have defaults and do not have to be specified. Do all out parameters have to be specified? So let's take that specific question before we move on to my take on this topic. So do all out parameters have to be specified? So when you're calling something that has an out parameter in it, when you call that procedure, you have to provide a variable to get the value back. It does not have to have a value. It can be null. And in fact, it doesn't matter what value is in it. If it's an out parameter, it will be set to null if you don't set it. So whatever's coming in doesn't matter at all. It only matters what's done by the procedure or function before control is passed back out. I think that is what you mean there. And so, and you also cannot provide a default value on an in-out or out parameter because you have to provide something, a container, to get the value back. Kevin says, returning out versus record. If all return data are related information, then yes, use a record, I assume, otherwise no. So in other words, if you're going to have a record here, it should be a record that contains related pieces of information. And I assume what you mean by that, Kevin, is don't create a record type just for that procedure to return whatever the out parameters are. And I would agree with that, and I'll come back to that. Is the functional programming concept applicable to Oracle PL SQL programming practice? I'm going to leave that to other people to ask because I don't really know about functional programming all that much. Okay, so while you continue your active chatting, my take is a little bit perhaps non-intuitive here. So I think that when it comes to multiple out parameters versus records, you have to balance out the UI that you're building, the API that you're using, and how it looks and how easy it is to use with what you have to build to support records. So for example, if I'm calling a procedure and I'm passing back like 2 different out parameters or 3, I'm not going to create a custom record type just for that particular procedure. I don't think the benefit's worth it. If you got like 15 of them, that looks like a pretty good use case, though I think it was Kevin's point, is that if it's 16 different unrelated pieces of data coming back, which would be odd since it's the one procedure. But anyway, you might end up wanting actual multiple record types for the different sets of data that relate to each other. And ideally, you've already got some record types created that you could use. That would be the ideal, that you may have a package spec that has some predefined record types that fit the different scenarios. And then in terms of converting something like this with my 12 or 15 out parameters to a record, also ask yourself, will I use it somewhere else? would this record be used somewhere else? Does it justify the creation, not only the creation of it, but also then people needing to declare and work with that record type? And finally, think about where and how the procedure is going to be used. So in this particular case, even with my 12 out parameters, I'm not going to convert it to a record type. Can anybody guess why I might say that in the context of where and how it will be used? Any thoughts there? I know it's pretty obscure. So what I'm talking about here is this procedure is called inside Application Express, Apex. Apex you can't work with records inside Apex. There are multiple items. So in this case, what I'm doing is filling in the values for multiple items on the page. If I created a record type, it would make this API cleaner. But when I called it inside my Apex process, I would have to declare the record based on the record type, call the procedure, populate the record, and then do a bunch of assignments for each of the individual items. So it literally made no sense. So I think this question of multiple outs versus record is very much a matter of a contextual answer of it depends. It depends on how many you've got. It depends on how it's going to be used and where it will be used. This is my take. Let's see what we got in terms of chat. So Yuda says, I think he meant that when calling a procedure without parameters, it is mandatory to specify return variables for all of them. Thank you, Yuda. That is certainly what I was saying. Isn't a big reason to use records that out parameters are required? A record allows you to return subsets of data. Okay, so that's a nice point, Nat. If I have let's say I have a record with 25 out parameters, 25 attributes, sorry, 25 fields, object type have attributes, records have fields. And so I suppose in the most general sense, you could say I have this general return record type, and it's got 10 strings, 10 numbers, 10 dates. I know, Nat, you nor anybody else is actually proposing this. But I could have this generic record type, and then I just fill in only the ones that are relevant. The other ones cannot be set, and that's okay. So that's another way in which the record interface, using the record in the API, makes things simpler for you, no question. I'm not sure that would be a good motivator for using a record versus outs, but it certainly gives you more flexibility. The record doesn't allow you to return subsets of data. You just decide which of the fields in the record you want to fill in. And someone else notes, records are more future-proof, extensible without having to change the calling code. Absolutely true. If I simply wanted to add another piece of out data to my get survey procedure, if I did it like this, I would have to add it as an explicit out parameter. I'd have to go to all the places that get survey is called to add another variable to retrieve that value back. And maybe if get survey is used in 100 different places, some of them need that new value, some of them don't. This is why I think this is very much a contextual sort of question and answer. If I had a record type, I could simply add an attribute to add a field to the record type, and then I wouldn't have to necessarily use it in any of the places that I call it. That's a really good point. And Sven comments that you can do functional programming or something close to functional programming with PL SQL as well. And I think, in fact, I was thinking UTPL SQL might use PL SQL in that way. And then Lisley asks, what if you are using a global record inside the package? And Nat, maybe you replied to that one saying JSON might be better for that. I'm not sure if that was the response or not. So right, so Nat is pointing out that if you want a lot of flexibility with the values you're returning back, maybe use JSON instead of a record type, because JSON is entirely unstructured and you can just jam in whatever you want. So that's certainly an option these days. Back to what if you're using a global record inside the package? So I think the question there is, instead of having it inside your API, why not just have a record variable declared at the package level inside your package, and your different procedures and functions in the package can simply reference that global variable directly as well. So I would say my answer to that one is don't do that. In general, having global variables in the package that are used by multiple elements or multiple subprograms in the package behind the scenes, not passed explicitly through the parameter list, is an invitation to lots of bugs, lots of difficulty debugging your code and fixing it. and lots of potential for people just walking all over each other's data, essentially, across the different programs they're writing. So I would say always pass things explicitly through the parameter list. It may be a little bit of extra work on your part, but it will almost always save you time in the long run. And I've got a question from Kevin too. Can I zoom in to the books in my background? I'd like to see what those books are. No, not today, but maybe next time. These are my PL SQL books. Up at the top are a number of books around software and evolution and all sorts of stuff, consciousness. But maybe we'll do that in another time. Take a walk around my office. Okay. All right, let's keep going. I think we're almost done. So did I finish this up? Yes, I did. Oh, that was it. Okay. I'd say now it's over to you, but I think this has been very much an over to you the whole time. So let's see if there are any other topics you want to talk about before we finish up for today. Right on time. Let's see. Usually when you call a PL SQL unit in an application, you should know exactly what type of data it will return. So it is not in place to start parsing a JSON object to see what you got. So Judith, I think that's really good advice, especially in the sense of, you know, as new technologies and new approaches come along, it's really tempting to want to use them. We've obviously faced this in the world of database and JSON and document DBs and NoSQL and so on. The new stuff is always the most attractive to us developers. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's the best fit for what we've got. So JSON gives you a lot of flexibility, and I'm sure enough of you have been around long enough to know that the flip side or the negative side of flexibility is flexibility. So many different ways to do things. Having totally unstructured data, then you've got to figure out what's in that structure, extract it out, and so on. So don't just say, I'm not going to use any more object types. I'm not going to use any more record types. I'm not going to do anything but have all my stuff in JSON. That might make sense for some situations, but for most of our work in the database, not so much. Tim says, I've used global records inside packages to aid with dynamic PL SQL. And I'm taking a look at his code. So we've got a general record based on a table. So is that just to make it easier to avoid redeclaring it over and over again? I'm not sure. Patrick asked, should a function have an out parameter? Patrick, I don't know if you came in late, but no, unless you decided to use functions like procedures, in which case, sure, have an out parameter, have an in-out parameter, do whatever you want. What about triggers? I thought we were going to discuss the pros and cons of triggers. Oh, triggers. Well, we're not going to make it today. Apologies for that. But I will mark down a note to do a session on triggers coming up soon. How's that? We'll talk about pros and cons of triggers. And then Patrick says, why does Oracle do that? You mean, why does Oracle let us have out parameters, Patrick? I would say the reason is that we don't want to be too condescending, too restrictive in how you can use PL SQL. I don't think that helps anybody. So there are all sorts of ways that you can use PL SQL that would be disadvantageous in most cases, but you might find a reason to do it. Why would we stop you? Okay, we are out of time. Thank you so much. That was a really great conversation. Thank you, Nat, for sharing your views on functions versus procedures. And hope you all have another great month of coding on the Oracle database, and I'll see you in September. Take care, everybody.